Alireza Firouzja plays what many people consider to be the perfect opening in his game against Fabiano Caruana this past titled Tuesday, September 5th, 2023. And the opening Alireza chose was the Berlin defense. Now, this used to be a sideline, very obscure. You'd find a couple of players at the Grandmaster level would play it every once in a while. You rarely ever heard of it. But when Kramnik used it to neutralize Kasparov's opening play with White in the World Championship match, all the Grandmasters started playing it. And ever since, it's just been a regular at every level of tournament play. And the idea behind the Berlin defense essentially is to neutralize White's activity. And then when you've done that, then try to win in the end game. But sometimes with chess, you never know how these pieces are going to go. Let's see how Firouzja plays the Berlin defense against fellow elite grandmaster Fabiano Caruana. Caruana has the white pieces. Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop to B5. The Spanish or Ruy Lopez opening, and they used to always play A7, A6 here. But the Berlin defense is what Firouzja plays. Knight to F6, immediately trying to put some pressure on E4. The pawn's not hanging just yet. The idea for black, the original idea of Kramnik, was this main line of the Berlin, which is bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, castles, knight takes E4, D4, knight to D6, pawn takes knight F5, and the exchange of queens. And what you have is a complex endgame with white, where white has a healthy kingside pawn majority, black has the bishop pair, and black is hoping, and it turns out this ends up being more than just a hope, that this pawn on E5 is a little overextended, weakening these light squares. And that was enough for Kramnik to neutralize Kasparov's play with white. Well, along with his unparalleled chess ability. That was the real issue. But these days, more often, white is playing this, and Caruana plays this move, D3. Trying to keep pieces on the board, keep things complex, keep queens there, and you can get a more interesting, more attack-oriented game of chess. Bishop to C5 from Firouzja, bishop takes knight, DC6. Now, the reason you're not taking towards the center here, that's the old principle, is after DC6, this bishop is liberated and developed. And also, black can get some pressure down the half-open D file. Knight B to D2. White has the idea of putting as much pressure on E5 as possible. This knight at D2 could come to C4. B3, bishop B2 is another idea that white has. So bishop to E6 controls the C4 square. If the knight jumps in there, black could take it. And here, by the way, if the knight takes on E5, then queen to D4 hits the knight and the pawn on F2, and white would actually be lost with that double attack. So castles is played instead. That covers F2. Now the E5 pawn is vulnerable. Bishop D6 to defend it. Knight to B3. Now, so why is the knight moving to the side of the board like this? Well, the idea is twofold. It can support the advanced D3, D4, which is white's main pawn break here. Or the knight can go to A5, where it is surprisingly irritating. It hits B7, and if black tries to play B6, then the C6 pawn would hang. So the knight is sort of aiming at that A5 square, so Firouzja plays A5 first, occupying that square so white can't play his knight there. Queen to E1, attacking that pawn twice with the knight and the queen. A4 kicks the knight back, and here the knight goes to A5 anyway, hitting the B7 pawn. It also could come back to C4. So, yeah, you don't want to play B6, because then knight takes C6. You lose that pawn, and you're attacking E5 twice as well as the queen, so that's bad news. Queen to B8 defends the weakness, or defends the pawn at B7 without creating a pawn weakness. So you don't want your queen to defend a pawn, but in this case, it's a good idea. Bishop to D2. The bishop can go to C3, put more pressure on E5. H6 keeps maybe a knight out of G5 from harassing the bishop at E6. Now bishop to C3. Caruana continuing to put pressure on E5. Knight to D7, defending E5. And now D4. White opens up the position. Now this is a little tricky concept here. Black's king is in the center of the board. So that's a good reason why you would want to open up the position. At the same time, black also has the bishop pair. So the opening of the position could go either way, depending how each player handles it. The bishop pair prefers open positions too. F6 defending the pawn. Pawn takes, and now the E5 pawn is a permanent weakness. It can only be defended by pieces, not pawns. Knight to H4 is played by Caruana, aiming at the weak F5 or G6 squares. castles, queen to e2. Now this knight can come back to c4 and maybe even go to e3, f5. The queen supports that move. Now rook to f4. A strong move from Firouzja, hitting the knight at h4. The knight has to make a decision. He jumps into f5. Caruana knows he's going to lose a pawn here, but is hoping for some compensation. So Firouzja takes the pawn. He captures the knight. Pawn takes, rook takes f5. So black has won a pawn, but the bishop pair is gone, and he does have a target here along with some weak light squares that Caruana might be able to use to provide some compensation. The one issue, though, of course, is this knight over here on a5 is starting to look lonely, so he needs to get that knight back into the game. Rook a to d1, pressuring down the d file. Knight to f6, that knight can go to d5, jump into f4, hitting the queen. The knight comes to c4, getting off of the side of the board and threatening the e-pawn 3 times. Knight to d5, the knight can go either way, allowing Caruana to take on e5, counting on counterplay in return for this pawn grab. First, the queen goes to e8, creating a pin down the e file on the bishop at e5. Rook f to e1 defends that bishop. So now, queen to g6. The idea is that this rook at a8 can shift over to e8, and now you would be pinning with a rook, which is more powerful than pinning with the queen because it's a less valuable piece. Knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, bishop to g3. So we have this bishop on g3 and this knight on d5. The knight on d5 looks good. The problem is it can be kicked out with this move c2, c4. Rook to f6 is played, and here c4 was a decent move. Instead, Caruana plays rook to d4. And now Firouzja plays b5. It turns out the better option was to just go ahead and play a3 to create dark squared weaknesses over here on white's queen side. If pawn takes, then rook takes, and black is in good shape with that pressure on the a file. If b3, then rook f to f8, preparing to contest the e file. c4 then hitting the knight, rook a to e8, queen goes to f1, rook e1, queen e1, rook to e8, hitting the queen f1, and knight to c3. And here black is clearly better with threats of knight to e2 check, forking the king and the rook, and also threats to the a2 pawn. But instead, Firouzja plays b5, trying to control c4, and it looks like a strong move, but it's actually a mistake on Alireza's part, really probably a blunder at this level of play. And it allows Caruana to play this move, c4. And what this does is it breaks up that queenside pawn structure of Firouzja's and creates targets that Caruana can go after. And now white is better. Pawn takes, queen takes. He's threatening this c6 pawn, which is the only thing supporting the knight at d5, so that central structure of Alireza's is beginning to crumble. Rook to e8, putting the rook opposite the rook at e1. He has to do something. If rook e8, queen e8, h3, and white's doing very well, and that leaves white in control. But Caruana decides to play rook to f1. He wants to avoid the exchange of rooks, and he's probably on the wrong track with that decision, as it turns out. Queen to f7, queen takes c6, knight to e7 hits the queen, and queen takes a4. So, looking at the position, Caruana is clearly winning now. He has a better minor piece. I think this bishop is probably better than the knight, it's fair to say, with pawns on both sides of the board. And also, pawns at a2 and b2. But there's a lot left to be said in this game. Remember, Title Tuesday is blitz, and a lot can happen. So let's see how Firouzja handles this position. How well does he defend? Knight to f5 comes in, hits the rook, also puts some pressure on the g3 bishop. That rook goes to d2, and now h5. And we see how Firouzja is putting maximum pressure on Caruana with threats of rook to g6 and h4 going down the g file, aiming at white's king. b3 makes sense, keeping that a2 pawn defended from the queen. Rook to g6, continuing his play. And now Caruana makes a committal decision that on its face looks smart, but is actually a blunder. He plays the move queen to c4, offering the trade of queens. So you say, well, you're up in an endgame. you want to trade queens. Well, that doesn't really work here, and we'll see why. A better option to the computer show us was h3, and this removes any back rank threats. White might be able to tuck the bishop back at h2, and these two pawns at a2 and b3 should reign supreme. But after queen to c4, it's actually Firouzja that trades queens. Queen takes c4, pawn takes, and now that beautiful construction of queenside pawns has been broken up, and you have a weak a2 pawn and a c4 pawn instead. h4. Now Firouzja's putting on the pressure, hitting that bishop. The bishop moves to f4. Rook e4, continuing to harass the bishop, always moving with tempo. Bishop goes to e3 and rook to c4. Now Firouzja has recovered one of those pawns. Rook to e1 again. h3 was still a decent move, but rook to e1, this allows black to create further weaknesses in the position. First, he plays h3. We see him aiming at this g2 pawn. Obviously, rook takes g2. Check is threatened, and now the table has turned, and Caruana is in big trouble. If he plays g3, then this move, knight to h4, would be devastating. There's no way to avoid a fork on f3. If the king moves, the knight still jumps in, and he'll fork the two rooks. If either rook moves, the knight hits the rook and the king and the remaining rook. There's just basically knight to f3 threat would give Firouzja a winning position, so Caruana has to do something else. So he plays rook d to e2, accepting that he's going to lose the g2 pawn, but now he is actually in big trouble, and the tables have turned. Rook takes g2 check, king to h1, and knight to h4, aiming to move that knight to f3, which would threaten unstoppable mate on h2. If the knight, let's say, goes to f3 here, after bishop f4, the threat is, of course, rook to h2 mate. If bishop to f4 to stop it, you just take it. And then you just check once or twice, but there's nothing you can do about it. So Caruana, in order to deal with that threat, plays f3 himself, trying to maybe trade rooks. But after knight to f3, Caruana runs out of time in this position, but as it turns out, Firouzja is completely winning on the board. If he plays rook takes g2, hg2 is with check, and the king has to take it, and then the knight would take on e1. And if instead he plays a move like, say, bishop to d2, then just knight takes e1. And it's decisive material for Firouzja. So he played the perfect opening. It's a blitz game. There was a lot of back and forth, but in the end, Firouzja was the winner. Hope you enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.